Hi, Sleeping for Hours family. Before you sleep, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our nightly videos.
Picture a summer day in New York, music lifting over a crowd, flags swaying, cameras fixed on a short, energetic man in a crisp suit. He smiles, raises a hand, and the cheering gets louder. Some in that square came for principle, some for spectacle, many for him. He insisted he was just a neighborhood father, a businessman with pride in his roots. Newspapers, detectives, and rivals said he ran an empire. He said he ran a movement. New York loved a character, and he knew how to play one. Yet this scene did not happen on a movie set. It unrolled at a rally built on a paradox, the most public face of a secret world. He pushed back on labels that stained an entire community, and he did it with stages, microphones, and meetings with reporters. How did a kid from Brooklyn end up here, surrounded by both fans and federal agents, both singers and surveillance vans? How did he build power in the shadows, then step into the sun? To understand Joseph Colombo, you follow the long, winding path from stoop to spotlight, from tight family dinners to citywide marches, from quiet deals to a roar that even the 5 families could hear. He came into the world in Brooklyn in 1923, the child of Italian immigrants who raised their children to work hard, keep family together, and mind their business. The borough shaped him. Tough streets, lively storefronts, Sunday tables that felt like a second mother, and the sense that the city would never hand you a break unless you took one. He was small in height, quick in speech, and careful with his public face. People around him would later say he was polite even when he was firm, direct even when most would dodge. During the war, he served in the Coast Guard, a simple fact that would mean a lot in later years when he told audiences he loved his country and wanted fairness for everyone with a last name like his. After that, he married young, started a family, and sought a way up through work that kept food on the table. He sold property, moved through trucking, tried small ventures. A tidy office with his name on the glass gave him the look of a straight-arrow operator. Yet in Brooklyn in those years, the line between businessman and connected could be a thread you could barely see. By the 1950s, the Profaci organization ran much of the life inside that thread. Joe Profaci kept a calm face and a strict hand. His network drew cash from gambling rooms, loan desks, waterfronts, and unions. Young operators who showed they could earn and keep quiet found a place. Joseph, sharp at reading a room and steady under pressure, began to rise. This was not a world of Hollywood dramatics. It was a pattern of routine. Envelopes picked up on a schedule, meetings over coffee, a nod and a handshake that meant a deal was sealed. Numbers games sheltered in candy shops and back rooms. Loans given on harsh terms. Union leaders leaned on to back a slate or steer a contract. According to agents and later court filings against the family, he helped manage parts of this flow. He also kept legitimate businesses close by, because a public face that looked ordinary offered cover. And because he liked the calm of a desk piled with forms and receipts, he moved smartly, avoided bars where trouble started, and told his crew not to boast. No one remembers his voice raised in those years. He preferred short talks that left no edges. The old Profaci rules drew loyalty, but they also drew resentment. By 1960, a restless group led by the Gallo brothers hated the tribute they owed and the way profits were carved. Tension grew into defiance, and the Profaci family split into 2 camps. The Gallo crew hit first. Kidnappings of key captains shocked the system and forced the bosses to bargain. When the hostages were freed, no real peace followed. It became a grinding feud. People changed routes home, carried worry in their shoulders, and watched their backs outside diners and clubs. Joseph was already a trusted ear in this storm. Calm at tables where others snapped at the smallest slight. He had a way of saying, "Let's keep it business," that cooled down hot talk. He also grew close to senior figures who wanted a steady future. Not a street war that drew too much light. Law enforcement pressure grew, and every sudden noise on a dark sidewalk now felt like sirens in the distance. Then the center of that world shifted. In 1962, Joe Profaci died, and Joseph Magliocco, his longtime ally, took the seat. On paper, nothing had changed. In practice, everything was in motion. Another storm boiled across the 5 families. The Bonanno leadership had its own ambitions, and an audacious plan took shape to tilt the city's balance by removing rivals. Magliocco, eager to prove himself, accepted a dangerous role. He passed along a message to a younger, effective capo named Joseph Colombo. Two important figures from rival families had to be taken off the board. The names in whispers were men who stood at the peak of New York's underworld order. The abuse of trust inside that plan made it more reckless than any street feud. A contract like that risked open war and drew a line no one could rub away. Here, Joseph made the choice that defined the next decade of his life. He went to the very people he was told to hit and revealed the plan. He did not hedge. He did not fish for a better deal. He told them who gave the order and put his own life in their hands. The commission, the round table that settled disputes and kept the city's crime economy from burning down, listened. In that moment, Joseph looked less like a climber and more like a stabilizer. He had saved the lives of men who held enormous sway and by doing so, saved the city from a conflagration. The commission summoned Magliocco, forced him out, spared him as an old man who had lost his way, and moved to choose a new head for the former Profaci family. They saw in Joseph a pragmatist with calm under fire and a willingness to put the whole picture above a single clan's pride. In late 1963, the decision came. Joseph Colombo would run the family. For the first time in modern city history, a family took the name of an active boss, and newspapers soon started using it as if the word had always been there. The Colombo family was born out of a quiet meeting and a single difficult choice. Becoming boss did not mean ease. He inherited a house still cracked from the Gallo Rebellion, with crews that did not trust each other and outside eyes everywhere. Yet he made moves that signaled how he planned to rule. He chose aides who worked cleanly and did not stir ego contests. He told soldiers to keep gathering small and stick to business. He favored negotiations that let everyone earn without sparks. He asked for discipline, no wild displays, no loose talk in bars, no sticking up guys with louder reputations than wallets. He was, in that sense, conservative for a man who would later reinvent public posture. He saw that erratic violence did not help cash flow. Harmony brought steady pickup days and steady union influence, and that meant steady power. The list of activities under his umbrella matched the standard mix of that era. Illegal betting, underground card clubs, loans with punishing interest, protection money from businesses that wanted peace, and the quiet hand behind labor corners that could slow or speed a dock, a warehouse, or a truck yard. He also kept a foot in legitimate ventures that gave cover for cash and venues for meetings. Prosecutors would later label all of this racketeering. He would call it business and deny criminal control. What everyone agreed on was his skill at presenting an ordinary face. He made time for his family. He walked through the neighborhood without a swarm of tough guys around him. He took pride in talking with anyone who approached him at a restaurant, a habit that contrasted with older bosses who hid behind curtains and closed doors. If his picture appeared in a paper, he did not flinch. He did not act like a ghost. That became his hallmark. In an age when public exposure was poison to men in his role, he looked straight at cameras. The city remembered those poses. A small man with a neat smile, tailored suits that fit, and a gaze that seemed to say he had nothing to fear from a flashbulb. This daring posture drew scorn from some peers. It also drew curiosity from journalists who saw him as a new kind of figure, less a shadow, more a civic personality with a private life everyone whispered about. He played that role with care. He never broke into profanity on tape. He never indulged in lurid talk. He stuck to the message that he was a family man and a businessman. Full stop. The Gallo problem did not disappear. Truce talks came and went. There were periods with fewer incidents, then sudden bursts when an old grudge lit up again. Joseph tried to make peace that did not look like surrender. He allowed certain concessions, shuffled territories, and tried to bring restless figures into the fold. Sometimes that worked, sometimes it curdled. He always returned to the same rule: earn quietly and make as little noise as possible. Yet even the neatest plan can't erase a history of slights. By the mid-1960s, with the city in flux and law enforcement using new tools, Joseph had to keep his head low while also keeping morale up. It was a balancing act. Offer protection to allies, punish internal theft, and avoid fights that turned small incidents into headline events. Agents watched him closely. The era of big sweeps and electronic ears had begun. His phone might ring and never be answered. He preferred face-to-face sessions with trusted people at busy lunch spots, where the buzz of the room covered his words. Case files built up around his name, full of surveillance logs and notes on who met whom, on which corner. Indictments against his associates named him as a power behind the curtain. Yet personal convictions proved hard to secure because he avoided placing himself at the core of transactions. He was careful. He trained others to be careful too. Loyalty was currency. He rewarded it more than raw muscle, a point that would later help him turn foot soldiers into public volunteers for a cause no one saw coming. By the later 1960s, he began to cultivate a civic presence. He appeared at neighborhood events, shook hands with block leaders, and delivered small donations that made parents and local clerics grateful. He saw the frustration felt by many Italian Americans who believed television news and movies slandered their whole community by focusing on criminals. He heard the anger when kids were teased in school about being part of some shadowy thing because their family names ended in vowels. He recognized a chance for a role only he could play, a spokesman who would say, "We are more than a stereotype." He stood on firm ground whenever he talked about service in the Coast Guard and the pride of blue-collar families. He pressed that story at every table that would listen. Then came the spark that turned civic talk into a mass movement around him. In 1970, federal agents arrested his son on a serious federal charge. Joseph took the microphone and said it was harassment. He insisted this was not about one family, but about an old, ugly habit of painting a whole people with a single brush. The outrage he wanted to channel already burned in many hearts. He gave it a name and a banner. The Italian, American Civil Rights League. Rallies began small and then swelled. Press conferences brought him in front of cameras more than ever. He pushed for offices to stop using words like Mafia in official statements. He demanded fair treatment by agencies that, he said, built cases first and asked questions later. People who had never met him lined up to hear him. He spoke smoothly, with the practiced timing of a man who had spent decades reading rooms. Behind that stagecraft, investigators said, his organization still collected from gambling rooms and loan clients, still pressed union angles to win contracts, still moved money through friendly businesses. He would reject those claims in public and keep the language of community rights in the foreground. He became, to many ordinary New Yorkers, the most visible Italian-American leader of the day. To many rivals and officials, he became a dangerous magnet pulling heat onto everyone in the clandestine world. That tension coiled around him like a spring. Each interview fed it. Each rally raised it. Each headline wrote a new line in a story that would crest in front of thousands of people and a forest of microphones, with music playing and flags raised, on a day no one there would forget. This was Joseph Colombo's evolution from a boy on a Brooklyn block to the boss of a renamed family and the conductor of one of the loudest public campaigns any New York underworld figure ever attempted. He had built influence through traditional rackets while keeping a neat public life. He had stepped forward during a crisis among bosses and been rewarded with command. He had patched a divided house enough to keep it standing. He had learned how to talk to cameras without seeming nervous. And then he had gone further, turning street-level grievance into stage-level spectacle. He did not boast about violence. He did not give colorful quotes about crime. He sold a message of dignity. It drew crowds. It also drew danger he could not control. In the years between his rise and those rallies, his activity included everything that made up the fabric of organized crime at that time, according to federal investigations: running illegal betting operations, taking a share from underground card games, profiting from numbers, extending harsh loans, and applying pressure in labor matters to secure contracts and smooth deliveries. He also steered extortion schemes disguised as friendly arrangements, where businesses paid for protection from trouble they often did not expect until a visit arrived. None of that was new in the city. He simply managed it with the efficiency of a small executive. He kept meticulous habits and maintained cover through legitimate fronts. The pattern was familiar to detectives and reporters who had watched the city's hidden economy for decades. They had never seen it paired with a leader so willing to step into daylight and call himself a civic figure. As that decade closed, he stood at a crossroads only he could see clearly. He believed the best way to protect his circle, and the wider community he said he spoke for, was through public pressure petitions, marches, and meetings with officials who hated the glare but could not ignore the numbers. Those closest to him warned that this energy cut against the instincts of an underground world that prized silence above all. He waved away those fears. He thought the city had changed. He thought the country had changed. He thought a man could wear a tidy suit, talk about liberty, and, with enough supporters behind him, convince even old enemies to stand down. The next act of his life would test that belief more than any quiet negotiation ever had. The organization he built began in a borrowed storefront with folding chairs, a tin cash box, and a stack of mimeographed flyers. Volunteers taped notices in windows, called cousins and friends, and told parish committees that a new group would speak up when television and newspapers painted Italian names with a single shade. He moved through these small rooms like a practiced host, greeting elders with respect, listening to parents who wanted their kids to feel proud of their heritage, and promising to push back against lazy labels. He told them that a community had to make noise to be heard. Those lines sounded simple because he made them sound simple, and it worked. Within weeks, the group he named the Italian American Civil Rights League had a phone line that never stopped ringing. Pickets outside a federal office came next. Men in work shirts stood shoulder to shoulder with women who brought strollers and teenagers who held cardboard signs. They chanted in steady rhythm, no taunts, no chaos, just a controlled show of numbers. He walked along the line, nodded to reporters, and repeated that words mattered. He singled out terms like Mafia and Cosa Nostra, saying those labels stained every honest person with a similar last name. He called for respectful language in official statements and a fair approach to investigations. Detectives watched from doorways. Agents took notes. The coverage grew, and with it, donations. The League paid for ads that said prejudice could be subtle, like a phrase used without thinking. He made himself available to civic clubs, student groups, and church halls, where he would remind everyone that his generation fought in uniform and his neighbors built the city brick by brick. The larger story behind those scenes remained what investigators called racketeering. He had been a mid-level figure under Profaci, then a captain, and finally a boss. He kept his own hands off street-level gambling rooms, but the money flowed up from them. He benefited from numbers operations that ran quietly in candy stores and barbershops. He was linked, by prosecutors and informants, to loan desks that advanced cash at harsh rates and demanded payments on time. He was said to hold sway over pieces of Union Life trucking routes, loading schedules, and contract bids, so that friendly businesses got favorable terms and unfriendly ones faced delays. He was accused of extracting payments from businesses that feared vandalism or wanted smooth deliveries. He did not brag about these things. He rejected them in public, yet they formed the backbone of his influence in a world that balanced legitimate storefronts with illicit revenue streams. He saw no contradiction in standing at a podium to talk about civil rights while agents filled folders on his organization. In his view, each person in the League came for their own reason, and he welcomed them all. Mothers brought their kids to block parties the League sponsored. Widows received help with bills. College students got small scholarships. He made sure those gestures were visible. He wanted clergy, PTA leaders, and merchants to see the League as a force for dignity, not a shield for wrongdoing. He spoke in a calm, almost soft tone at these events. He avoided dramatic flourishes. He focused on fairness and respect. That choice of voice kept him on television and radio as a regular guest, which only increased the friction with quiet men who believed the safest boss was the boss you never saw. The first mass rally arrived like a summer festival. Streets near the center of Manhattan filled with families, union locals carried banners, and performers offered songs between speeches. He strode onto the stage in a suit that fit perfectly and waved to a crowd that stretched block after block. He asked them to remember their grandparents, to value honest work, and to reject portrayals that made every Italian surname sound like a code word. Rumors later said the turnout ran into the tens of thousands. Numbers aside, the sight mattered. Overnight, he became the most recognizable Italian-American voice in the city. That thrilled many people who came to march. It alarmed leaders in other corners of the underworld, who believed his profile risked pulling law enforcement straight through their doors. The commission, which guided the city's criminal economy with an unwritten rule of silence, was not a fan of parades. He understood the risk but believed, stubbornly, that the time favored open advocacy. He tried to reassure skeptical peers that visibility would soften pressure. He told them that the League could channel anger into peaceful protest, that it would keep younger men away from street fights, and that high-profile outreach could even nudge officials into dialogue. He was not naive. He simply thought he could manage heat the way he managed every other complicated situation, with negotiation, favors, and clear boundaries. He did not stop the day-to-day collection of debt payments or the coordination of betting rooms. Rather, he kept those operations tidy and separate, insulating legitimate fronts from dangerous talk, insisting on short, careful meetings in crowded places where microphones would be drowned out by clattering plates. As the League grew, Hollywood called. A film about a fictional crime family wanted to shoot in New York, and newspapers said it would use certain words that the League opposed. He met with the producer in a room full of cameras and then again behind closed doors. He said the community had been caricatured for decades and asked for script changes that would avoid slurs. The filmmaker, eager to shoot in the city without protests, agreed to remove some terms. The production gained access to locations and extras who appeared in scenes set on city streets. He considered it a victory for representation and told supporters that they had proven a point. Organized, respectful pressure could make powerful institutions listen. Even critics who distrusted him as a crime figure admitted that this outcome showed political skill. Alongside these public moves came federal cases that pressed against his circle. Indictments named his associates in schemes that ranged from illegal gambling to labor corruption. Subpoenas landed on his doorstep for testimony before grand juries. He answered some questions and declined others, careful not to violate legal advice. He hired seasoned attorneys, made bail when needed, and staged the same message after every court date. He was a family man and a businessman, smeared by bureaucracy. Privately, he adjusted routines. He changed driver routes, swapped meeting spots, and told subordinates to cut chatter on phones. Agents installed new tools in their investigations, and he responded with old wisdom. Keep conversations short, use safe intermediaries, and avoid displays that attract cameras for the wrong reasons. The Gallo feud simmered in the background. With one of the Gallo brothers serving a long stretch, street violence had eased, but grudges did not go away. Men with long memories watched the League with suspicion. Some saw a chance to embarrass him. Others saw opportunity in the attention he drew. He worked to keep the peace while retaining clear rules. Territories were allocated carefully. Collections were scheduled on time. Permission for risky ventures was limited. Discipline mattered because steady earnings depended on it, and because any flare-up could ruin the League's messaging. He avoided personal insults in that conflict, a tactic that prevented escalation more than once. Still, the situation was never fully under control. It was held in balance by relationships, favors, and fear of the repercussions that would follow a serious breach. Meanwhile, the League built a network that looked almost like a political machine. It had neighborhood captains, weekly phone lists, a newsletter, and regular meetings with sympathetic city council members and state legislators. He sent delegations to television stations to argue for fair casting. He arranged sit-downs with editors about the words used in headlines. He courted clergy to bless rallies and stand behind him on stage. The message always came packaged with real examples. A bakery owner turned down for insurance because an underwriter disliked his accent. A teacher who felt students were stereotyping a child because of his last name. These stories mattered. They gave the movement a human face and softened perceptions that he was just a boss trying to polish his image. He also used the League to show muscle in non-violent ways. When a merchant claimed harassment, he organized a crowd to accompany the merchant to a hearing, filling the room with faces that showed the community cared. When an agency issued a statement he disliked, he asked followers to write letters and call officials. He understood attention better than most. He knew a polite crowd of voters could accomplish what a threat never should. Still, the duality never went away. At night, envelopes reached his gatehouse. Bookmaking proceeds were counted. Complaints about late payments were handled. Debts were moved between fronts. His crew respected the line he drew. The public-facing League avoided anything that smelled like intimidation. The private operations remained quiet and efficient. Tension rose as he scheduled the next major rally. Advisors split. Some told him to scale back and declare victory. Others encouraged another show of strength to keep political momentum alive. He chose the bigger stage. Music acts were booked, speeches drafted, and flags ordered by the case. He rehearsed brief remarks that stressed unity, patriotism, and pride. He loved that last word, pride, and used it whenever microphones were present. Behind the scenes, his detail planned a basic security flow. It was not a militarized plan. This was a civic event, and he thought too much policing would undermine the message. He relied on familiar faces near the stage, the kind of watchers who could spot trouble by body language alone. The day broke bright. Streets around the plaza filled with families again. Vendors hawked snacks. Television crews set up tripods. He moved through the crowd with handshakes and brief exchanges. He reached the podium, waved, and began the first warm lines of his speech. What followed happened fast. A man posing as a cameraman stepped forward from the press area, drew a handgun, and fired at close range. People screamed and ducked. Bodyguards surged. The assailant was stopped almost instantly. Medics rushed in. The scene went from music and banners to ambulance sirens in minutes. He was loaded onto a stretcher and taken to a hospital under a curtain of police cars. Reporters spoke over each other. The city froze for a moment, stunned that a movement wrapped in civic language had ended its biggest day with an attack in front of everyone. Doctors fought to stabilize him. Statements from the hospital came in calm but cautious tones. He had been gravely wounded. He could not speak. He remained in critical condition. Family clustered near the intensive care unit. Priests visited. The League set up a table for cards and flowers outside its office. Rumors sparked throughout the underworld. Some blamed the Gallo camp. Others blamed bosses angered by his refusal to step back from public life. Later, accounts pointed different ways, none with absolute proof. The shooter, an unknown to most, left no clear trail of a larger conspiracy that prosecutors could prove in court. The mystery hardened into lore, a community leader to some, a controversial figure to others, cut down at a microphone he had used to demand respect. In the weeks that followed, the League tried to keep going. Rallies paused out of respect and shock. Volunteers ran community programs, scholarships, and a legal assistance fund. A few local offices stayed open. Leaders close to him issued statements asking people to stay calm and keep the mission alive. But the energy had changed. Without his careful stagecraft and steady voice, the movement lacked the same pull. Some politicians backed away. Newsrooms turned their attention to the investigation and to speculation about underworld motives. Federal agencies intensified surveillance on known associates. A community that had celebrated a new voice now faced the loss of its central figure and the quiet return of an older pattern, people retreating to family, work, and small circles. Inside the organization he had run, decisions had to be made. Doctors were clear. Recovery would be extremely limited. He could not manage day-to-day affairs. Trusted lieutenants began to divide responsibilities. Some handled collections from betting operations. Others managed union contacts to ensure contracts stayed on track. A consigliere stepped forward to bridge disputes between crews. Everyone knew the structure he built could function without him for a time, because he had emphasized order over spectacle in private matters. But absent the boss's balancing act, old rivalries flickered. A few men used the uncertainty to test limits. Law enforcement saw the same opening and moved to squeeze bookies, loan collectors, and bagmen. Cases that might have waited months surfaced within days. He lay in a hospital bed, then at home with round-the-clock care, surrounded by family. Visits were limited. Rumors circulated about brief moments of recognition, fingers that moved, a whisper that might have been a name. Accounts differed, and doctors warned against false hope. The reality was harsh. The man who had built a public movement and run a hidden economy could no longer speak for either. For a time, his portrait still hung behind the League's desk. Supporters stopped by to sign a get-well book. Children looked up at the photo and asked parents why the man in the picture was always in the paper. Parents spoke softly about pride and controversy, about a man who fought for respect and made powerful enemies, about how a city can turn in an instant. The question of responsibility remained unsettled in the public record, and it still does. Observers offered theories. Some said the Gallo wing staged the hit to reassert itself after prison releases. Others said rival bosses engineered it as a corrective, an attempt to restore the old rule that leaders stay out of the spotlight. There were even claims that the shooter had his own motives unrelated to any larger directive. None of it resulted in convictions that answered the central question beyond doubt. What stands without dispute is the effect. His movement lost its head, his family lost its voice, and the network he led had to reorganize on the fly. The city, meanwhile, learned once more how fragile a carefully curated public role could be when it collided with the deep currents of a world built on silence. Long before that day, he had chosen a path few in his position would have touched. He pressed cameras into service instead of treating them like poison. He used a civic vocabulary to push back against what he saw as disrespect, even as prosecutors alleged ongoing crimes beneath the surface. He demanded changes from a studio that made a defining film, and got them. He rallied a community that felt typecast and gave it a banner to stand under. And he carried on with the machinery of his underworld life, steady and unflashy, taking shares from betting, loans, and union angles, trading favors to keep workers and shipments moving, maintaining the kind of discipline that holds a complex operation together. That contradiction, public champion and private boss, makes his story unique in the city's history. It drew crowds and built enemies, and in the end, it brought him to a hospital bed where the loudest voice of his world had fallen silent. He lay in a quiet room, blinds half drawn, machines marking a rhythm that never changed. Nurses learned his schedule, and the small comforts that kept him settled. Family rotated in shifts. His wife held his hand and told him about the day outside, a way of keeping time for someone who could no longer keep it himself. Children and grandchildren brought soft talk and the sound of life. Friends who had stood on corners with him in the old days arrived with careful faces, staying only a few minutes, saying simple blessings, then leaving before emotion overtook composure. Newspapers still wrote his name, but the man who had courted microphones could not speak. In that stillness, people built their own versions of him. To some, a civic advocate who had tried to clean a stain from a community. To others, a boss who crossed a line by stepping onto public stages. Detectives examined the moments that led to the attack. The shooter, Jerome Johnson, had blended into the press area with a fake media credential. He fired at close range, then was shot and killed in the chaos by someone never firmly identified in public reports. Theories filled the months that followed. Many suspected the Gallo wing, freshly energized by early releases and resentments that stretched back a decade. Others whispered that leaders from other families, vexed by his refusal to step away from bright lights, had allowed or even encouraged the act. Some wondered if the shooter had been used by people who did not belong to any crew at all. No jury ever settled the conspiracy question, and no judge announced a definitive narrative. The public story hardened around fragments: a man with a borrowed identity, a crowded plaza, a microphone cut off mid-sentence, and an ambulance racing to a hospital that would become a second address. With the figurehead sidelined, the League tried to keep its promise of civic work. Staffers mailed newsletters with updates on scholarships and neighborhood projects. Volunteers organized tutoring sessions, blood drives, and food collections. Clergy who had stood behind him at rallies still lent support. Yet momentum sagged. The League had been built on his timing and his presence, and that could not be replaced. People who joined for the cause stayed a while, but the excitement faded. Some donors returned to private charity. A few organizers tried to expand the League into a broader coalition with other ethnic groups, but it never regained the same pull. The phone still rang at the office, just less often, and the focus shifted from big public gatherings to local service. Inside the family he once ran, a different clock started ticking. A temporary leader stepped forward to manage day-to-day affairs. Joseph Iacovelli, a senior figure with years of experience, acted as a coordinator to keep the machine running. Others carried weight in their zones. Collections from betting rooms continued as before. Numbers, bankers reported up the chain. Loan payments arrived on schedule, and when they didn't, quiet visits resolved it without noise. Union channels still offered leverage over deliveries and contracts. The emphasis remained what he had always preached in private: order, routine, and a business-like approach. But absence at the top creates its own gravity. Old feuds stirred. Young men with ambition tested rules. Law enforcement, sensing vulnerability, turned up the pressure with new roundups and more subpoenas. A feud that had never truly ended now found air again. Gallo loyalists had moved through their own cycles of leadership and punishment. That group saw an opening and began to reassert itself in places it once controlled. Tension flowed into clubs, restaurants, and street corners that had been calm for months. Meetings between emissaries were held to cool the temperature. Some succeeded, for a day or two. Others ended with a curt handshake and no real settlement. In April 1972, during a birthday gathering at a seafood place in Little Italy, Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo was shot and mortally wounded. The city woke to another shocking headline, the kind that froze people on sidewalks as they read it. Rumors pointed to figures connected to the Colombo family, though attributions varied by source and often contradicted each other. A witness later identified a participant, and informant accounts named names, but debates about the exact configuration of the hit team have persisted ever since. What held steady was the consensus that the feud had reached a grim milestone and that the balance of power shifted again. As the feud settled into a new phase, the legal landscape changed too. Federal attorneys started using a statute that had entered the books in 1970, a sweeping tool designed to prosecute patterns of racketeering connected to an enterprise. Investigators collected wiretap snippets, ledger pages, union records, and testimony from people willing to cooperate. This approach did not rely on catching one person in one act. It connected activity across months and years. Members of his organization, at various levels, faced cases that alleged bookmaking operations, credit card fraud rings, hijacked shipments, kickbacks tied to construction or trucking, bribery of union officials, and schemes that extracted regular cash from businesses in exchange for protection or smooth services. His name appeared as the beneficiary of a flow that reached upward from all these corners. He did not walk into a courtroom to answer for those operations during his incapacitation, but the circle around him did, and convictions built a public record of the enterprise he once directed. Even with pressure rising, the people who had stayed loyal did not abandon the practices that made the system hum. They continued to run card games tucked behind storefronts, and to keep figures tight. They avoided flamboyant displays. They held to the discipline he had impressed upon them. Still, any long-running outfit changes with time. Some men retired quietly. Some flipped and entered witness programs. Others rose in the ranks, bringing new styles. Carmine Persico, a veteran with strategic instincts and a cool manner, slowly consolidated influence. By the mid-1970s, even as he faced his own legal issues, he was widely seen as the family's central figure. He had earned the nickname the Snake years earlier for his ability to slide through tight spots. Now that trait helped him steer an outfit buffeted by scrutiny and internal strain. Meanwhile, the League's most public moment, its negotiation with a studio over a film about a fictional clan, continued to echo. The film opened to enormous success, and reporters remembered that the production had reached an accommodation with the League to avoid certain language and to ease filming in the city. The producers had also allowed community members, some friendly to the League, to appear as extras and worked with local social clubs on logistics. Supporters of the League pointed to it as proof that respectful pressure could yield change. Critics of the League argued that Hollywood had simply made a pragmatic deal to keep cameras rolling, and that the broader effect of the film cemented, not softened, stereotypes in the popular mind. Either way, his presence at that negotiation remained part of his legacy. A boss who, in public, wore the hat of a community spokesman and got results that most civic groups would envy. During these years, his personal world shrank to rooms with family photos. Doctors adjusted medicines. Therapists tried small routines. Friends read out loud from the news. Celebrations came to him. Birthdays with cake and candles lit in a kitchen. Grandchildren playing on a rug. Holidays marked with prayer and stories about old times told in careful tones. A man who once protected his schedule like a trade secret now depended on others for every basic task. The quiet tested everyone close to him. It also drew them closer. Family learned how to advocate with hospitals, how to navigate insurance, and how to keep a household running on a completely different rhythm. Neighbors offered casseroles and rides. Former colleagues sent flowers, mass cards, and envelopes to help defray costs. The network he had built for business purposes now showed its human side, at least in the circle around his bed. For the record keepers at federal agencies, his name remained on charts as boss, incapacitated. Internal memos noted that he could not manage operations directly. Yet when agents interviewed cooperating witnesses, his influence still appeared in the way people spoke about him. They said he had insisted on routine, discouraged showy violence, and favored deals that kept money moving without public disturbance. They said his balancing act between public posture and private operations had brought both dividends and risk. They said he had been both deferential and firm in dealings with other bosses, quick to smooth disputes, slow to tolerate theft from within. They acknowledged that his decision in 1963 to reveal a plot against rival leaders had changed his life and the city's underworld map. They also called his creation of the League the boldest deviation from underworld tradition anyone could remember. Questions about his personal culpability continued to stir debate. He had never been convicted of the kind of violent offense that made splashy headlines. Instead, his name appeared on indictments alleging perjury, conspiracy, and obstruction connected to financial and union matters. In one case, he was charged with lying to a grand jury about his ties to business ventures suspected of being fronts. In another, prosecutors said he had taken a piece from a credit fraud ring by providing protection. Some cases ended without convictions. Others sank under appeals or witness problems. The accumulation mattered more than any single result. A portrait emerged of a man who layered legitimate businesses over an underground system that collected from illegal betting, extracted payments from merchants, influenced labor decisions through friendly officials, and shaped which companies won or lost on docks, in warehouses, and on construction sites. He always denied being a boss. He used the language of a businessman who happened to be active in his neighborhood. Law enforcement and rival crew members, who later talked under oath, painted a different picture. The public also learned more about how the League functioned behind the scenes. Reporters found that it had a formal structure, with officers, committees, and block captains. It had dues, bank accounts, and ledgers. It sold buttons and bumper stickers. It coordinated legal aid for those who claimed harassment. It also overlapped, in places, with the social networks that underpinned his family's private economy. Some donors were bookmakers and trucking men. Some marshals at rallies were the same men who sat at the back of certain restaurants to watch who came and went. None of that was illegal by itself, but the blend caused unease among officials, who believed the League acted as a cover for influence. He had insisted it was about respect and fairness, and many participants lived that mission honestly. Yet the dual identity of the founder could not be ignored, and once he fell, the organization could not keep its footing without looking like a shadow of what it had been. A softer, more personal thread ran through those years, how he was remembered in the neighborhood. Store owners told young clerks that he had always paid his tab. A barber kept a framed photo of him sitting in the chair, cape fastened, eyes half closed, looking as relaxed as he ever did in public. A bakery marked his birthday with a tray of cannoli sent to the hospital staff. People who had shouted his name at rallies now lowered their voices when discussing him with strangers, protective of a memory that outsiders might judge harshly. At wakes and christenings, an older generation told stories that balanced pride and caution. They said he stayed polite, even when he made a firm point. They said he preferred neat clothes. They said he took time with elders. They did not deny his role. They simply placed it within a framework of loyalty and duty they believed outsiders never tried to understand. The city was also changing. New enforcement strategies made street-level gambling less visible. Credit schemes moved into different channels. Unions faced reform campaigns. New populations moved into neighborhoods long dominated by one group, shifting the social fabric. He would not have recognized parts of the landscape by the mid-1970s. The corner clubs where he once sat were quieter. Younger men who might have joined his crew chose different paths. Even funerals looked different, smaller, more private. Stripped of the large processions that had once been a sign of stature, the old ways had not ended. They had simply adapted, and he was not there to guide their adaptation. By 1978, after years of limited responsiveness, his body gave out. He died in May, with family nearby. Obituaries ran under formal headlines that used his full name and his title as a reputed boss, then stacked up the familiar facts. Brooklyn. Born son of Italian immigrants. Coast Guard veteran. Businessman. accused head of a crime family, founder of a civil rights league that held huge rallies and confronted language in government and media, survivor of a near-fatal attack who never fully recovered. Tributes arrived from supporters who remembered the pride he instilled. Condemnations appeared in editorials that called him a symbol of corruption. The funeral was watched from a distance by agents and journalists, but it was not a spectacle. It felt restrained, almost suburban, a closing that matched the quiet of his last years. What remained after his passing was a complex record. He had reached the top of an organization built on illegal revenue streams. Bookmaking, numbers, loans, union manipulation, shakedowns disguised as protection, and various frauds that skimmed from shipping, construction, and retail. He had balanced those with legitimate businesses that gave cover and cash flow. He had used his influence to broker truces and to punish theft within his sphere. He had also launched a very public movement that sought to reshape how an entire community was seen, pressuring institutions to change words and practices, raising scholarships, and, for a time, giving people who felt stereotyped a platform to stand upon. That combination of roles was rare, controversial, and unforgettable. In the years that followed, books, articles, and documentaries kept returning to his story. Some framed him as a paradox, a man who mixed the language of rights with the mechanics of rackets. Others took a sharper line, arguing that his civic persona served to protect and expand his operations by wrapping them in a flag. A few voices from his neighborhood, including family members, offered a more personal view, recalling a father who insisted on respect for elders, pushed his children to do well in school, and believed his service in uniform meant something even as he navigated a world outside the law. The archive holds all these angles now. When people say his name, they bring their own assumptions. The facts offer room for interpretation, but they do not disappear. He rose from a local crew to lead a family. He engaged in the rackets that defined that era. He built a platform that challenged portrayals of Italian Americans, and he paid a price for the risk of living both as a hidden figure and a public one. His legacy within the underworld was a set of expectations. Earn without noise. Keep crews coordinated. Put discipline above ego. Make peace when possible. Use influence in labor not to blow up jobs, but to control their flow. Avoid unnecessary harm that brings investigators running. These were practical rules, meant to preserve revenue and reduce risk. They were not moral statements. They were survival strategies. His legacy within the public sphere was different. It rested on the idea that language carries weight, that institutions can be pressured peacefully, and that a community can gather in great numbers to insist on fair treatment. The two legacies do not fit easily together. Perhaps that is why his story still stands out. It does not resolve neatly. It sits at the edge of two worlds that usually refuse to touch, and in that space, he tried to run both a careful machine and a public campaign that changed the way New York talked about a word. Years after his voice fell quiet, the city still carried traces of what he set in motion. In living rooms where grandparents watched the evening news, people remembered how he had turned outrage into orderly marches and meetings. On sidewalks outside old social clubs, younger men listened to elders tell how a calm demeanor could move as much weight as a shout. In that space between memory and record, his past widened. It was not only the rallies, or the day everything stopped. It was also the long line that stretched back before any camera found him, to a childhood shaped by an absence and a lesson learned early. Life on those blocks could lift you or swallow you, and the difference often came down to discipline. His father, Anthony, never saw his son become the public figure the city would debate for years. Accounts say the elder Colombo worked as an enforcer in the Profaci world and died violently in 1938, a killing that went unsolved. Joseph was a teenager then. He left school, signed on with the Coast Guard during the war, and returned with the habit of order that uniformed service breeds: punctuality, routines, neat clothes, and a belief that calm in the face of trouble earns respect. He married Lucille, started a family, and tried legitimate paths: real estate, commodity deliveries, small ventures where cash turned quickly. Those efforts mattered even later, because they gave him a public face that looked like 1,000 other strivers in the boroughs. Side by side with that face, a second life took shape. He had inherited not only a name but a network, and in Brooklyn, a network could be an engine. He stepped into Profaci's structure as a man who kept meetings short and promises longer. The income streams were the same ones that had fed crews for decades: Numbers, bets scribbled in pencil on slips, card rooms tucked behind storefronts, sports wagers settled week by week, and loans extended on terms that punished lateness. The language was coded but plain. A piece meant a cut from a local operation. A package might be a set of payments tied to a truck route, a warehouse, or a union contact who could quietly steer a job. The waterfront, with its thicket of locals and stevedore rosters, offered leverage that could delay cargo or move it faster. Construction sites, with their contractors and subs, offered another set of levers. On paper, it looked like influence. On the ground, it felt like gravity. He learned to move that gravity without causing tremors that shook loose headlines. Investigators later wrote that he avoided the messiness that got others caught. He did not wave guns, make loud threats in bars, or show off. He kept front small firms that acted as meeting spots and, sometimes, vehicles for cash that could be explained as sales or rent. He taught people around him to act like clerks, not cowboys. Deliveries were logged. Meetings were held in diners and shops crowded enough to mask conversation but familiar enough to provide shelter. If someone owed, a conversation would begin with a reminder, not a scene. If a store owner wanted peace, he was introduced to a service, no agency listed in a phone book. The result, according to prosecutors who chased it, was a smooth system of extortion and protection that stayed quiet precisely because it relied on routine. That quiet cracked in 1960 when the Gallo brothers rebelled against Profaci's take and tactics. Kidnappings of high-ranking men shocked an organization that prided itself on predictability. Hostages were released after negotiations, but the bruise remained. The feud hardened into a pattern of ambushes and reprisals that made even veteran men nervous. Joseph navigated this era as a counselor who prized cool heads. He argued for settlements that let everyone earn. He did not always get his way. He did, however, earn a reputation for seeing past the next week's tally. That perspective mattered when, after Profaci's death and Magliocco's brief tenure, a scheme to tilt the balance of power across the city reached him. The request he carried removed two of the most powerful bosses in New York was reckless. He took it to the intended targets, and by doing so, saved lives and likely averted a war. Out of that decision came his rise. The commission recognized him as the new head of the old Profaci family, soon to be called by his name in every paper. As boss, he tightened the old rules. He told crews to avoid public scenes. He insisted that disputes be handled through sit-downs. He kept the menu of rackets familiar: betting, numbers, card rooms, loans, union manipulation, and a steady stream of insurance payments from businesses that wanted stability. He shielded these operations with legitimate interests: realty, small import and export outfits, trucking-related firms that gave plausible explanations for cash and meetings. Through the 1960s, he faced cases that reflected the world he ran. He was arrested on perjury charges tied to questions about hidden stakes in businesses. He was named in indictments that described conspiracy to extract payments from merchants and steer union decisions. He hired lawyers, fought the cases, and often emerged without a conviction. Where charges stuck against others, his name appeared as a beneficiary, not a man caught with a hand on the trigger. The city around him changed. After the Valakai hearings in 1963 publicized terms and structure, the press used words like Mafia and Cosa Nostra with a new confidence, and television scripts followed suit. He watched as kids with Italian last names got teased in school, and as small business owners felt judged before they greeted a customer. He recognized both an injustice and an opportunity. The injustice was simple. No one wants to have their identity reduced to a stereotype. The opportunity was bolder. A man in his position could try to channel that anger into a movement that made institutions change their speech. The league he formed did that. Volunteers made phone trees and newsletter routes. Clergy joined stages. Families massed in public squares without chaos, a signal that the group could mobilize without menace. They petitioned the FBI to rethink how it labeled suspects in press briefings. They asked newspaper editors to be more careful. Most visibly, they sat with a film producer and secured script adjustments that removed certain words, while guaranteeing access to locations and cooperation that eased production. He had turned private leverage into public persuasion, Around the same time, the people under his umbrella kept doing what they had always done. A betting office might handle thousands of dollars in wagers in a week and move a percentage up the chain. A numbers bank would pay out small wins daily and still clear a profit with volume. Loan desks advanced money with interest that built fast, and collectors visited on time with serious faces. Shipping containers were not moved without someone noting who paid attention and who did not. Some of these schemes became clearer in court when insiders flipped. One case described a credit card fraud ring that used stolen or counterfeit plastic to buy appliances, which were then fenced through friendly stores. Another outlined kickbacks tied to contracts on small construction projects. A third described labor peace arrangements that kept pickets away from a job in exchange for regular envelopes. His lieutenants acted as brokers and enforcers. He acted as the man who set the tone. No drama, no sensationalism, no headlines. Inside his orbit were figures whose own cases drew attention. An underboss, widely known for old-school toughness, was convicted in federal court for bank robbery-related charges, a case that prosecutors said showed how underworld money sometimes blended with traditional heists. Captains faced charges tied to hijacked trucks and to skimming from union benefit funds. These prosecutions did not directly pin violent acts on him, but they told the public that the organization he led touched a wide array of crimes: theft, fraud, coercion, and schemes that exploited labor structures for private profit. He responded, as always, with lawyers and a steady message that he was a legitimate businessman under siege by overzealous agents. The League's success brought a new kind of friction. Old bosses liked the dark. He stood under lights. They worried that rallies turned investigative interest into a floodlight. He argued that public respect would lower pressure, not raise it. He promised that crowds would be peaceful, that requests would be reasonable, and that officials would have to acknowledge the force of numbers. He believed he could walk through this contradiction because he had done similar balancing acts before, calming feuds while keeping revenue flowing, courting reporters while keeping private dealings off tape. What he could not control were the feelings of men who had spent their lives believing silence was safety. He could not change how far some were willing to go to enforce that belief. The attack that ended his public life set off a chain of events that reshaped his world. The shooter, using a fake press credential, struck at the height of a rally that looked like a festival. The aftermath was swift. Sirens, stretchers, a hospital ward, and then a long decline that left him present in body but distant in voice. The League kept working for a while, then lost steam. The family kept earning, then changed hands, with experienced figures filling the space until Carmine Persico's influence settled the line of succession. The Gallo feud, dormant and then revived, reached a violent climax on a spring night in Little Italy. None of those steps brought clarity to the question of who wanted him silenced. Rumors pointed in all directions. No court settled it beyond argument. For people who study such histories, the line between what can be proven and what is widely believed matters. What can be proven fills court records. He led an enterprise that profited from illegal gambling, extortion, loan sharking, fraud, and labor racketeering. He faced charges for lying under oath and for conspiring to obstruct investigations into those activities. He formed a civic organization that held massive rallies, negotiated with a major film production, and protested federal agencies' language. He was shot at a public event and survived for years in a severely impaired state before dying in 1978. What is widely believed fills books and late-night conversations. That rivals feared his public persona, that his movement embarrassed men who had spent lifetimes teaching their crews to treat cameras like poison, that the attack came from anger within the underworld rather than from any lone grievance. The stresses that played out during his leadership were not unique to one family. In New York, organized crime thrived on a triad: illegal markets that generated cash, legitimate businesses that laundered and protected that cash, and unions that offered leverage in industries where delays carried a cost. He was adept at maintaining that triad. He preferred methods that avoided spectacle because spectacle invited crackdowns. He knew how to speak to contractors, foremen, and foremen's bosses to remind them that meeting a schedule could be made easier with cooperation and harder without it. He knew how to walk through a warehouse and see where a small favor done today would pay off 6 months later. He understood how a neighborhood bakery, a cleaning company, or a realty office could be both a business and a shield. Yet his story remains unusual because he built a second machine that operated in daylight. The league's offices felt more like a campaign headquarters than a clubhouse. Sign-up sheets, donation lists, event calendars, press releases. He borrowed tactics from politics, phone banks, endorsements, mass mailings, and from civic life scholarships, food drives, neighborhood patrols that were explicitly nonviolent. He built relationships with local officials and brought them to stages where the backdrop was flags and families, not shadows and whispers. He taught supporters to chant without menace, to hold signs without insults, and to keep events tidy. He had learned how order protected him in one world and applied it to another. In the years after his death, his children and grandchildren did something simple but lasting. They told family stories. They remembered a father who liked a certain deli, a grandfather who insisted on punctual holiday dinners, a man who smiled during small jokes and kept his temper under a lid others admired. They did not write legal briefs. They preserved a person. Meanwhile, writers and reporters assembled the public record piece by piece. They placed him on timelines that included the Appalachian meeting, the Valakai hearings, the reconfiguration of power among the five families after the early 1960s, the passage of the racketeering statute in 1970, and the wave of cases in the 1970s that began to shift strategy from chasing one crime to mapping whole enterprises. In those timelines, his moment falls at a pivot. The old quiet running up against a new era of public knowledge and televised debate. Walk past certain corners in Brooklyn today and you see a city that has moved on. The social clubs are fewer. The storefronts house yoga studios and bakeries with chalkboard menus. Yet a few reminders remain. A barber still keeps that framed picture of a tidy man in a chair. A parish hall still has a yellowing thank you card for a scholarship given in the early 1970s. A faded button from a rally rests in a box on a closet shelf. These small artifacts say something larger than any speech. They say that a person can be many things at once: neighbor, father, boss, advocate, and that the city holds all those versions, even when they don't align. For those who look to extract lessons, his story offers practical ones. In any system that relies on secrecy, attention is a risk. In any city where culture and commerce meet, language matters. Organizations survive by routine, not by stunts. Leaders who calm disputes save money and lives. Movements that remain peaceful win legitimacy faster than those that invite fear. Also, contradictions carry costs. He tried to reduce those costs by separating the rooms where he worked. But walls are porous when the same man stands in both. In the end, his most daring experiment, turning a private figure into a public champion, could not outlast the doctrines of a world built on closed doors. None of this makes him a hero or a villain in simple terms. It makes him a figure whose life reflected the city's tensions at a specific time. Pride and prejudice, law and custom, ambition and caution. He built an income machine that reached into industries, then built a civic brand that reached into living rooms. He relied on loyalty and offered protection, then asked those same networks to show up as citizens. He kept his suits neat and his voice measured, even as agents clipped reports to files with his name at the top. When people ask why his story still draws attention, the answer may be that he tried to solve a problem: how to protect his people. However, he defined them by walking in two directions at once. Few have tried it. Fewer still have tried it on as big a stage, with as steady a gait, or with consequences as far-reaching as the ones that trailed him from stoops to stages, from closed-door sit-downs to a public square that turned, one day, from music to sirens. He built his days around small habits that made the bigger risks feel manageable. Morning coffee at the same hour. A stack of newspapers folded into thirds. A brief drive with one companion, never two, to a diner where the soundtrack of forks and conversations gave cover to short meetings. He liked neat suits, polished shoes, and punctual arrivals. For all the noise history would attach to his name, he prized quiet. He believed order kept men calm, kept money moving, and held trouble at bay. That habit showed in both lives he ran. The front-facing world of family and civic talk, and the under-the-surface world that brought in cash from activities prosecutors, later mapped in ledgers and wiretap transcripts. What he managed depended on routine more than bravado. Gambling ran on schedules. Bets placed before first pitch or kickoff, numbers played before noon, collections made after supper. Card rooms opened behind ordinary doors. The men who supervised them acted like clerks, not bouncers. Lists kept, payouts recorded, arguments cooled with a glance. Loans moved out to people who needed quick money and back from people who learned fast that late payments carried a cost. The umbrella word was protection, which sounded benign to outsiders, but, in practice, meant a payment stood between a business and headaches it could not afford. The sums were often small week by week but hefty by the season. He understood that the secret to longevity was never letting a single score overshadow the steady stream. On the waterfront and in trucking depots, influence played out in seemingly mundane decisions. A shipment arrived, and either moved quickly or sat, and time was money. A shop steward had a say. A foreman had a say. The man who could harmonize those voices had leverage. Investigators later said, his people greased that machinery through friendly union officials, or through intermediaries who knew when to raise a hand and when to fold it. Construction offered a parallel field. Deliveries, permits, and inspections created choke points that could be eased for a price. The phrase labor peace appeared in files to describe agreements that kept pickets from a site or kept equipment from being mysteriously delayed. None of it looked dramatic from a distance. Up close, it translated into envelopes that went upstairs on a predictable path. He balanced these streams with legitimate fronts that gave him respectable reasons to meet, to deposit, and to explain income. Real estate ventures, small service companies, and import-export offices provided cover. Titles and leases offered paper trails that could withstand casual scrutiny. He liked that blend because it let him move between a bank lobby and a back room without whiplash. When agents asked questions, he pointed to the above-board entities. When he talked with supporters of his civic effort, he referenced a businessman's schedule and a father's obligations. He kept the two stories separate in public, even as prosecutors said they braided together behind the scenes. Legal trouble found him often enough to show the stakes. He faced perjury counts tied to testimony about business holdings. He was accused of lying to a grand jury regarding his interest in companies linked to financial schemes. He denied those charges and hired seasoned counsel. Some counts were dismissed. Others ended without convictions when witnesses faltered or juries balked. He learned to keep answers short and to let lawyers do the talking. He never swaggered on courthouse steps. He repeated a simple line about being a family man and a businessman, and he returned to a routine that, to him, proved the point. Inside his world, discipline made him valuable. He rose in the Profaci structure because he kept his voice down and his accounts clear. Older men trusted his knack for smoothing tempers. That skill mattered when pressure spiked during the Gallo revolt. The attempted strangling of Larry Gallo in a Brooklyn bar back room, interrupted by a quick-thinking policeman, sent a shock through an organization that prided itself on calm. Retaliation. Bread. Retaliation. People chose different streets to walk home. In meetings, he took the chair that argued for settlements that let everyone earn. His words did not end the feud, but they marked him as someone who could see past the next pay night. That reputation set the stage for the moment that changed his life. After Profaci died, Joseph Magliocco took over and became entangled in a broader plan born from rival ambitions. The scheme was as blunt as it was reckless. Eliminate two top bosses from other families to tilt the city's balance. The message reached him with an expectation that he would carry it out. He took it, instead, to the intended targets. That act turned him, in an instant, from messenger to mediator. It spared lives at the top of the city's underworld, averted a chaos no one could contain, and won him an audience with the people who sat at the highest table. The commission forced Magliocco out, and, seeing in this younger figure a steady hand, acknowledged him as head of the former Profaci clan. Newspapers soon used his name to label the entire organization. As leader, he ran the family like a medium-sized firm. He delegated to captains who shared his preference for quiet earnings. He set rules. Avoid public scenes, resolve disputes at sit-downs, limit the size of gatherings, and keep loose talk out of bars and cars. He preferred arrangements that made money without inviting spotlights, bookmaking, numbers, loans, and labor angles that affected schedules rather than headlines. He did not want firestorms, and he scolded men who brought noise. Investigators said he also structured extortion so it looked like security or consulting, language that masked purpose while making payments feel normal to the people who made them. If a restaurant owner needed calm on a busy night, a call to the right intermediary ensured calm. If a contractor needed deliveries to arrive on time, a monthly envelope kept deliveries punctual. He embraced public attention in a way no one in his role had dared. He told reporters there was no such thing as a secret society with a name. There were only individuals, some honest, some not, and it was slander to tar all people with Italian roots with a single word. He appeared on stages, in interviews, and before crowds that grew from hundreds to tens of thousands. He pushed a message that sounded patriotic and practical. Treat our community with respect. Stop using terms that stereotype. And address grievances through peaceful action. He founded a league that looked like a civic association and ran like a campaign, phone trees, newsletters, committees, fundraisers, and rallies with music. He gave scholarships and sponsored neighborhood events. He met with editors and producers and told them words mattered. He secured script changes on a major film so that certain terms were removed, and in return, the production filmed in the city without disruptions and cast locals as extras. He considered that a sign that organized, nonviolent pressure could work. At the same time, the less visible machinery he oversaw kept humming. Informants and court records later described the mechanics. Bookmakers took wagers in barbershops and candy stores, passing a cut to the next rung. Numbers runners collected slips and sent totals to bankers who paid out small wins from a float built on volume. Loan collectors visited politely first, then firmly, but never theatrically. A credit card fraud ring bought appliances and resold them through friendly stores. A trucking crew skimmed goods from hijacked trailers. A construction arrangement ensured no problems at sites that paid up. He did not sit in rooms while each of these things happened. He set the tone that made each of them predictable and insisted that his envelope arrived without excuses. All of this carried a cost. Other leaders watched his public campaign with alarm. They had spent careers teaching their crews to treat cameras like open flames. He walked into the frame and smiled. They believed he was inviting attention that would not stop at the edge of his stage. They did not buy his argument that civic legitimacy would soften investigative zeal. No one wrote their disagreement down, but the tension was plain. People who had tolerated his rise because he had saved them from a disastrous plot now considered whether his new style jeopardized the larger ecosystem. He, for his part, thought he could manage it as he had everything else by setting boundaries, cutting deals, and keeping order. He misjudged how much resentment that spotlight could breed. The day of the second giant rally, a man with a fake press badge stepped forward and fired at him from close range. The attacker was shot and died at the scene. The leader who had turned anger into orderly protest was rushed to a hospital and would never speak in public again. He lived 7 more years, surrounded by family, cared for by nurses and therapists, visited by friends who kept their word short. The league carried on for a while, then ran out of the spark only its founder could provide. The family he led continued to earn, and, over time, coalesced under the influence of Carmine Persico, a strategist who believed in patience and structure. The feud with the Gallo wing reached a blood-soaked turning point when Joe Gallo was shot in a Little Italy restaurant the following spring. Eyewitnesses, informants, and later writers ascribed motive and method differently, and debate still runs through those accounts. But the broad picture held: a long-running conflict had claimed its most famous figure. Federal strategy evolved in step with these events. Prosecutors leaned on a statute designed to capture the pattern of an enterprise rather than one isolated offense. They showed juries how loans, gambling, union influence, truck hijackings, fenced goods, kickbacks, and security payments formed a system with a leadership tier that set expectations and took the largest share. His own court appearances before the attack focused more on perjury and obstruction, how he answered sworn questions, how he described his role in businesses than on headline violence. After the attack, he was beyond the reach of active prosecutions. The circle around him, however, faced trials that produced convictions and testimony that filled the public archive with the contours of the machine he had managed. He measured success not in flashy purchases, but in steady compliance. A storefront paid on time. A union official answered the right phone calls. A truck departed without delay. A meeting ended with a handshake and no hard feelings. He rewarded men who favored calm and punished, quietly, men who brought unnecessary confusion or theft. He liked the kind of lieutenant who kept a ledger cleaner than his shoes. He disliked street theater. He had learned early that noise brings attention and attention brings heat. That same insight drove the way he ran his civic effort. The rallies had music and flags, not threats. The speeches leaned on patriotism and family, not grievance for its own sake. He saw that crowds who behaved well won sympathy. He believed the style would protect the substance. Critics said the civic effort served as a shield. They argued that donations, public goodwill, and relationships with officials insulated his private economy. They pointed out that some of the League's marshals were the same men who watched doors at private clubs. They noted overlap between donors and people who appeared in case files. Supporters countered that the League delivered tangible benefits, scholarships, community events, and a successful push to change language that many found insulting. Both claims could be true at once. The overlap reflected the founder's dual identity. That duality is why his story still resists neat retelling. He lived at the seam between a neighborhood's pride and an enterprise built on lawbreaking, and for a time he made both sides move to the same rhythm. The personal glimpses that survived softened the edges without erasing them. He loved a certain bakery's sfogliatelle, preferred coffee slightly sweet, and kept pictures of his children within reach on a desk that was never messy. He seldom raised his voice. He could stand in a doorway for 15 minutes to greet passers-by and make them feel heard. He tipped generously at holiday time. He was polite to clergy and teachers. These details matter because they explain how he held a crowd's attention on a stage and how he built trust at tables where trust rarely lasted beyond the meal. People wanted to believe in someone who kept his word and kept his temper, even if they knew or suspected the other life he led. In the end, the fullest list of what he controlled appears in the kinds of cases his associates faced. Illegal sports betting, numbers banking, card games, loans at crushing rates, payments for protection, credit fraud, stolen, goods pipelines, and interference in union processes that affected shipping, construction, and trucking. Extortion wore the clothes of consulting and labor peace. Threats rarely sounded like threats. They sounded like advice about how to avoid trouble. Money moved through safe hands and safe places. Legitimate companies provided paperwork to back up cash flow. Sit-downs resolved disputes about who owned which slice. Those are the activities that built his reputation in the world he ran, and the allegations that filled the filings of the world that chased him. His death closed the book on a singular experiment, one that other bosses did not repeat. After him, few leaders tried to build a public movement around pride, while running an illegal economy in private. The cost, on that June afternoon, had been too high. Yet the echoes of his gamble can be heard in later debates about language, representation, and the way institutions talk about entire communities when they report on crime. He did not write a theory. He staged a demonstration. He showed a city what can happen when someone from a closed world insists on stepping into open air and speaking like a civic figure. The results brought change in how a film talked about a people, how agencies drafted releases, how kids felt about their last names at school, and they brought a backlash from men who preferred the old doctrine of secrecy. Walk long enough through Brooklyn and you will hear his name in tones that shift with the teller. To one person, he is the father who told children to finish homework before dinner. To another, he is the man who protected a shop during a tense month. To a third, he is the boss who kept the crew earning. To a fourth, he is the leader who stood at a microphone and told a crowd they were worthy of respect. All of them are describing the same person. The contradiction is the story. He kept 2 rooms running at once, one lined with flags and microphones, one lined with envelopes and ledgers, and believed discipline could hold the wall between them. For a while it did. Then the wall split, and the consequences defined the rest of his life and much of his legacy. He learned early that power grows in quiet rooms. A morning could start with a kiss on the cheek from his wife, a school drop-off, and a stop at a bakery for a box of pastries. Then came the circuit. A row of short meetings, each 10 minutes long, each with a clear purpose. A captain would give a brief update on collections from betting slips taken at barbershops and candy stores. Another confidant would report that loan payments were arriving on schedule, and that anyone showing signs of trouble had been nudged, gently first, then with more steel in the tone, never with a scene. A man from the docks would list which containers moved without delay and which needed a push. A union contact would mention a contract vote and how to make sure it went smoothly. He would listen, ask 2 or 3 questions, assign a next step, and stand to signal the end. There were no speeches in those rooms. There were decisions. Bookmaking stayed the spine of the earnings. Wagers on baseball in spring, boxing on weekends, football in fall. Horses most days fed a system that had been part of New York's underbelly for generations. The structure did not need reinvention. Clerks wrote numbers, runners carried slips, officemen totaled columns, collectors gathered envelopes. The house took a cut and moved a percentage up the chain. When a bettor won, he was paid promptly. When he fell behind, he heard from someone with a calm voice who reminded him of terms. The quiet handling was deliberate. He despised drama. Payouts and pickups occurred on a timetable that reduced friction and made the whole thing look less like a crime and more like a service a neighborhood expected. Numbers play worked alongside the sports action. People liked the dream of turning a few coins into a small bag of cash, and those little bets added up. A bankroll was kept to cover winners, but volume made sure the bulk stayed in the pot. He never advertised. Word of mouth did the work. A woman who baked bread on the corner might pass a slip with the same hand she used to tie a string around a loaf. A barber might jot an entry behind the drawer he kept combs in. The sums were modest, the rhythm constant, the risk contained by familiarity and trust. That was his preferred formula. A river of small streams instead of a single roaring cascade that could flood a block with trouble. Loans were the stern face of that economy. A shop owner needed money to cover a slow month. A gambler needed funds to settle a bad run. A trucker wanted to buy a used rig and lacked bank credit. Cash arrived quickly with a rate attached that punished late payers. The first reminder sounded like concern. The second visit sounded like a deadline. Only when someone refused to listen did the tone sharpen. Even then, the instruction to his collectors was consistent. No spectacles. He knew that fear could be conveyed by nothing more than a glance, a hand placed flat on a table, a pause that stretched just long enough. He built rules around that restraint. Men who broke those rules caused attention, and attention was the enemy of earnings. Extortion wore polite clothes. The term used in files, protection, turned something rough into something that resembled an insurance policy. A bar on a busy street liked the idea that fights would not start at its door. A warehouse preferred that deliveries arrive on time and trucks leave unmolested. A contractor needed to know that deliveries wouldn't be mysteriously delayed or that demonstrations would not erupt when concrete was scheduled to be poured. The payments were dressed up as consulting fees or security retainers. In human terms, they were a tax for peace, in places where trouble could appear overnight without warning. He taught the men who managed these streams to speak in the language of service, not threat. To any outsider, it sounded almost normal, which is how a difficult thing becomes durable. Labor was the lever that could move entire industries. He learned the names of stewards and foremen, the patterns of shifts, the quirks of dock schedules, the weaknesses of a truck depot's paperwork flow. A timely phone call could ensure that a container was unloaded first, or that it sat just long enough to matter. A handshake with a union officer could turn a heated contract vote into a calm ratification. It was not about locking a gate. It was about understanding how a gate swung. The same logic applied at building sites. Deliveries of steel, cement, and lumber followed sequences. Slip a step, and a whole job fell behind. The man who could keep the rhythm steady had power greater than his height, and soft voice suggested. He did not need to shout. He needed only to nod and have others respond. Fronts shielded the engine. A small realty firm allowed meetings to happen in an office with a typewriter and a secretary. A service company offered invoices that explained deposits. An import-export outfit provided a reason to visit docks and talk to foremen without raising questions about why a man in a tailored suit cared about forklifts and pallet jacks. These outfits had real clients and real paperwork. Some even made modest profits. He liked the way they rounded off the sharp edges of the life he lived behind them. When reporters asked what he did, he could point to a shingle on a door and a list of customers that any accountant could understand. The image he cultivated was tidy. He spoke in a measured tone and avoided coarse language on tape. He wore narrow ties and crisp shirts, and the suits fell just right across the shoulders. He showed up at community events with a check for a church roof or a youth league, posed for photos with politicians who wanted to be seen as friends of a voting bloc, and shook hands with police commanders who, off camera, would go back to signing surveillance requests. He went on television and said there was no such thing as a single monolithic underworld. He said people with names like his were tired of being reduced to a caricature. He could say that and believe it, even as he signed off on arrangements that law enforcement would label extortion or racketeering, because he placed his work inside a story about neighborhoods taking care of their own. The Gallo feud pressed against that story like a thumb against a bruise. Old resentments grew new wings when men came home from prison, when plans for a peaceful coexistence rubbed against memories of slights and kidnappings. He tried to cool it by offering concessions that left dignity on both sides. One corner would change hands. A bar would be left alone. A contested revenue stream would be split. These were not acts of generosity. They were business decisions aimed at keeping the temperature low enough to prevent an explosion. He knew he could not afford a war on the front page. He also knew he could not appear weak. In his world, those two truths never stopped arguing with each other. Law enforcement developed a new playbook during his reign. After televised hearings demystified the structure of the city's hidden economy, agencies invested in long cases. Wiretaps captured lines of code and nicknames that agents learned to decode. Ledgers were photographed and then returned to drawers, allowing cases to grow without alerting the men who filled those columns. Informants who had known him as a young man started to age out of the life and traded information for a quieter future. Prosecutors charged him several times, not with headline violence but with offenses designed to chip at his credibility. Lying under oath, denying connections to businesses that showed signs of being fronts, refusing to answer questions and inviting contempt findings. He fought and often won. The victories did not erase the paper trail. They only delayed the day when pieces would be arranged into a larger picture. That picture became clearer when he stepped onto stages and declared a movement. The first time he marched to a federal building with a line of supporters and a set of demands, even seasoned observers blinked. No one in his position had tried public advocacy with that kind of scale. He insisted that the group would remain peaceful. He asked for simple things that sounded reasonable to many ears. Stop using terms that lump people together, meet with community leaders, recognize that families like his loved the country and served in its wars. He drew crowds that looked like block parties, grandmothers in sunglasses, teenagers with flags, men who had finished a shift and kept on their work boots. He knew how to make those images count. The negotiation with a film production brought his methods into high relief. Producers wanted locations and goodwill. He wanted a script that did not use words he believed slurred his neighbors. The meeting was both a photo opportunity and a practical discussion. He kept the cameras outside, then sat in a room with doors closed and made a trade. Language softened in exchange for a smoother shoot. Locals stood as extras in neighborhood scenes. A club that usually avoided outsiders became a set for a day. The city watched a man who had been called a secret boss act, instead like a civic broker. He drew praise from people far removed from his private world. He also drew anger from men who thought he had dragged their lives into daylight to win points with editors and producers. The day of the attack followed a familiar plan until it didn't. A stage on a plaza. Musicians warming up. Families filling the square. He walked to the microphone and started a set of lines he had practiced. The first shots ended that routine, ended his public life, and started a different kind of clock. The assailant, carrying a camera case, had secured a place near the stage by posing as a member of the press. He fired at close range and was killed seconds later. The man on the stage was taken to a hospital and never truly returned. For years he stayed between rooms, eyes opening and closing, a hand squeezing back once in a while, family wondering which moments reached him and which drifted past. The movement he had built continued for a time, and then dwindled to a trickle of service projects and newsletters. The organization he had led continued, then reshaped itself under a successor who liked structure more than spectacle. He would not have liked the word empire. He preferred family to describe the men who worked beneath him and community to describe the people who lived around him. But the scale he managed justified the larger word. Revenues flowed week after week from gambling, loans, labor angles, and payments from businesses that understood the benefits of keeping certain people happy. Truck cargo that went missing found its way into storerooms owned by friends. Credit card fraud blossomed as plastic became common, and rings under his umbrella used stolen accounts to buy goods that were then fenced in bulk. Construction contractors learned which bids to submit and which to skip, based on quiet guidance from a man who had never swung a hammer but understood timelines better than some engineers. Each of these streams depended on a system of trust, enforced by reputation as much as by pressure. He was, paradoxically, both conservative and novel. Conservative in the sense that he relied on traditional rackets, betting, loans, extortion, dressed as security, union manipulation, and favored discipline over flash. Novel because he believed a man in his position could stand beneath bright lights and win a public relations battle while keeping his private machine running smoothly behind him. The novelty paid off for a season. It won concessions from a studio that feared pickets. It put pressure on agencies to explain their language. It gave families with Italian names a sense of being seen in a moment when television traded heavily in caricatures. Then the novelty exacted a price. It made him too visible for men who had sworn oaths in rooms with covered windows. It invited a response that took him away from decision-making and left the people who depended on his steadiness to improvise. The improvisation started immediately. A senior figure kept the chair warm and handled disputes that bubbled as rivals tested limits. The preference for orderly earnings held for a while, then wavered when ambitious men thought they could get away with grabbing a bigger slice. A respected intermediary kept sit-downs moving and prevented outbursts from turning into public brawls. The undercurrent of the Gallo fight returned in brief surges. A restaurant became a target on a spring night, and a storied figure died eating late with a small group. Eyewitness accounts formed a cloud around that case, never settling into a single, undisputed narrative. Through it all, the money machine chugged. Courts called it an enterprise. Men on the inside called it the life. He left behind a trail of charges that mapped his path. Perjury counts, connected to grand jury testimony about hidden ownership in businesses, conspiracy allegations tied to extortion schemes that touched storefronts and markets, contempt findings for refusing to answer questions about money that moved through fronts. He beat more cases than he lost, but each docket entry added a layer to a portrait prosecutors wanted juries to see. The portrait did not include direct acts of violence because he avoided placing himself where those acts could be attached to his name. It included a theory of leadership, that he had profited from a pattern of activity spread across multiple sectors of the city's economy, from the way cards were dealt in a back room to the way boxes were loaded in a warehouse. In rooms where strategy was taught to young men, he was held up as an example of how to run a crew without burning it down. Keep meetings short. Speak clearly and softly. Pay on time and expect the same. Don't drink where you do business. Don't boast. Don't take photos with strangers. Keep your suits clean and your ledgers cleaner. He believed those rules mattered more than the mythology being built around his name in newspapers. He believed a man could be judged by the absence of chaos as much as by any parade he organized. He carried that belief into every decision, from which man would run a corner to which reporter he would grant a quote. Neighbors who had never seen the inside of a clubhouse remembered different pieces. He would stop in a doorway and ask the shop owner's mother about her health, lingering just long enough to show he meant it. He would donate to a school fair and ask nothing in return beyond a note in a program. He kept his public face open enough that people forgot, for a moment, the other face presented in indictments and on nightly news broadcasts. That split explains part of his influence. People will give a man space to move if they trust him to keep a block safe and orderly, even if they privately suspect the cost of that order is an envelope moved from a cash register to a coat pocket at closing time. After he died, the story continued without him in ways that made his era look like a hinge. The government's use of a racketeering statute shifted the ground under all the men who had grown up in a world where bribing one official or fixing one union vote could be treated as a standalone event. Now those acts were presented to juries as steps in a pattern. Years after his funeral, the city watched a sweeping case that put multiple bosses at a single defendant's table for running a citywide commission. Some of the men who had served with him or under him stood in those courtrooms and listened as wiretaps and ledgers tools sharpened during his own time were used to convict a generation. His chapter had closed, But the system he helped refine was now being prosecuted in full color. Ask men who worked in his shadow what he did best, and they say that he kept conflict contained. If a collector went too far, he took him off the street quietly. If two captains built rivalries, he sat them down with a witness and drew a line they could both live with. If a Union contact started to believe his own legend, he reminded him that legends don't keep schedules, discipline does. He rewarded loyalty with steady assignments, and punished theft not with fireworks but with exile. A man cut out from a reliable stream of income felt the loss more keenly than any scolding at a table ever could. He understood that punishment could look like silence. Ask the families who marched with him what he did best, and they say he made them feel seen. He gave them a day in the sun, banners to hold, and a language of pride that did not need to shout. He told them their grandfathers had built bridges and their grandmothers had kept families whole through lean years. He told them their service in uniform counted. He told them that they should reject words that turned an entire heritage into a shorthand for crime. He gave scholarships with names printed in neat type on certificates that hung in living rooms for decades. He made television anchors say the name of their community without a sneer in the tone. He made kids walk taller into schools where classmates had learned jokes from scripts that made them targets. The contradictions never resolve, even now. He built a careful machine that took money where the law said it should not, and used influence where the law said it must be kept clean. He built a civic machine that asked for respect and often got it. He kept his head when others lost theirs, then risked that head by stepping into a light his peers believed would burn anyone who stood beneath it. He paid a heavy price for that risk and lived his last years listening to other people speak while he remained silent. The men who replaced him adopted some of his habits and rejected others. None of them tried to replicate his public campaign. They preferred a return to the old ways, to closed rooms and low voices and no parades. The record of his life is long enough to support both admiration and condemnation. In court files, his name sits beside charges that map out extortion schemes, gambling rings, loans that hurt people who fell behind, and manipulations of labor that injected private gain into public work. In photo albums, his name sits under pictures of a father smiling with a child on his knee, a man standing at a podium asking for fairness, a neighbor at a festival with a paper plate of food, and a line of people waiting to shake his hand. Every city holds such figures, the ones who seem to stand at an intersection where law, culture, and business take turns ignoring traffic lights. He stood there longer than most. He did it in tailored clothes, with a soft voice, and an unwavering belief that order would keep him safe. For a while, it did. Then the thing he could not control found him, and the city that had watched him build two machines at once learned how quickly a stage can turn into a stretcher, and how long a family can spend in rooms lit by the glow of a television that once showed their father's face talking about pride, and now shows archivists arguing about who he really was. What he did, in the end, is a list that can be read in different tones. He ran illegal betting. He oversaw numbers banking. He took a share from card games hidden behind storefronts. He extended loans at high rates and enforced them with pressure that rarely needed to be said aloud. He extracted payments from businesses in exchange for peace. He influenced union processes to favor friends and punish stubborn contractors. He used fronts to shield this income. He fought court cases tied to these activities, mostly avoiding convictions that would have taken him away for long stretches. He built a public organization that massed supporters in peaceful rallies, pressured institutions to watch their words, won changes from a major film, and gave out scholarships. He created a movement that made people proud, and a backlash that made some men furious. He took a message intended to calm communities to a stage where someone delivered violence. He lived with the consequence, and died with his family nearby, leaving behind a city that still tells his story in voices that differ, but always return to the same facts. A boy from Brooklyn grew into a leader who kept a hidden economy steady, and tried to put a public face on a community that felt caricatured. He did both well enough that neither world could forget him, and both worlds changed in his absence. Time has a way of turning a public figure into a story told in kitchens and storefronts. Long after the parade stopped and the microphones fell silent, his name still moved through conversations like a breeze that makes the curtains lift. In one house, a grandfather would point at a black and white photo and say that the small man in the suit taught crowds to be orderly, even when they were angry. In a barber shop, A customer would tap a newspaper clipping sealed under glass and say that the same man kept arguments from becoming disasters. The details shifted from teller to teller, but the outline held. Joseph built a method around calm, and it shaped both the life he conducted in daylight and the enterprise he controlled in rooms without windows. What made that method effective was not mystery, but discipline. He managed information like a banker counts bills slowly, precisely, and with Ant-Hin-Wan, separation. One person heard one assignment, not three. Captains stayed in their lanes, passing only what was necessary upward. Friends outside the life saw only the public face, a family man, a small business owner, a neighbor who contributed to parish events. Reporters saw a spokesman who talked about fair language and community pride. Agents saw the target in the center of memoranda that described gambling revenue, loans with punishing terms, quiet payments from merchants, and levers in unions that turned lateness into timely arrivals. Each group knew a slice. He insisted it stay that way. The revenue streams he oversaw were the familiar ones that had powered crews for decades. Sports betting generated steady cash during every season. Numbers play turned pocket change into a reliable reservoir because many small bets produce a large pool. Card games tucked behind legitimate businesses ran on trust and careful management, not bravado. Loans advanced at terms that rarely broke the letter of a contract because there was no contract on paper, only a handshake and a memory. Merchants paid for peace, a word that covered everything from a night without broken glass to a delivery that arrived when it was supposed to arrive. Unions offered a subtler advantage. If the man who set the schedule owed a favor, a foreman did not have to be told twice how to keep a line moving. He added and subtracted details like a bookkeeper adjusting columns. At times, the circle handled hijacked goods, with items taken off the back of trucks ending up in warehouses where friendly store owners could buy stock at a discount. In other moments, the money came from credit schemes that used stolen cards to purchase appliances and electronics, later fenced in bulk. Certain construction bids were nudged. Certain inspection timetables grew flexible if the right hands were greased. Each effort looked small on its own. Together they formed a network that fed the center without drawing fireworks. He favored quiet efficiency over showy stunts. That preference doubled as a safety plan. No matter how routine he made it, the law never stopped watching. Perjury charges landed when he testified about his involvement in companies that looked like fronts to prosecutors. Conspiracy counts named him as a beneficiary of payments extracted from shop owners and contractors. Subpoenas followed him to offices where, on paper, he had nothing to hide. He learned to keep his tone flat and his answers brief, to let lawyers do their work, and to avoid statements that could be twisted into admissions. In many cases, he came away without a conviction. The files did not shrink, but verdicts did not pile up against his name the way they did for others. He treated each legal challenge as another table to negotiate, not a fight to win with noise. His leap into public life remains the part that makes people lean in when the story is told. He created an organization that looked and felt like a civic association, with committees, newsletters, phone trees, banners, rallies, and scholarships. He chose goals that sounded like common sense. Ask agencies to reconsider how they used certain terms. Ask studios and network producers to avoid slurs. Ask newspapers to separate one man's crimes from an entire group's identity. He stood at a podium and spoke like a neighbor, not like a firebrand. That was the point. He wanted a broad crowd that included grandparents, students, shopkeepers, and war veterans. He knew that peaceful energy gains legitimacy that fury cannot hold. The League's biggest victory played out on a movie lot and on city streets. A production adapting a novel about a criminal dynasty wanted to film in New York. The script included words his group opposed. He met the producers. Cameras flashed outside as he walked in, then stayed outside as the talk turned practical. The script changed, removing certain terms. The production gained access to locations. Extras came from neighborhoods that had supported his rallies. Both sides claimed success. He told supporters that respectful pressure works. The studio got its scenes. Viewers later debated whether the film cemented the very image he had tried to soften. No matter the verdict, the negotiation proved his skill at trading influence for concessions without raising his voice. That ability to keep voices low did not erase the feud that had scarred his organization years earlier. The Gallo faction never forgot its grievances. After he was shot and could no longer manage daily affairs, old tensions flickered. Talks were held. Territory was shuffled. Agreements were made and then tested. During that period, the most famous figure from the rival camp was killed while celebrating a birthday at a restaurant in Little Italy. Accounts differed about who pulled the trigger and who planned it, and debate still runs through books and interviews. The broader view is clear. The feud that began under Profaci continued, shifting shape each time leadership changed. And the absence of the man who kept order with a light touch made the balance harder to hold. Life at home during his final years became the opposite of the stages he had once owned. Chairs were arranged around a hospital bed. A television murmured in the background. Nurses monitored routines. Family members told stories that filled the room with the sound of ordinary days: who visited, who called, who won a softball game, who made a sauce the way his mother used to make it. Friends arrived with careful eyes and short greetings, leaving before their faces gave away the weight they carried. In that quiet, the two sides of his life fused in the only way they could. The man who had run elaborate arrangements now depended completely on the simplest forms of care. The organization he left behind did not break apart, but it changed. A seasoned captain kept disputes from spilling over while a strategist with deep roots consolidated authority. The new era brought new cases shaped by a law that allowed prosecutors to argue that gambling, loans, extortion, labor interference, fencing, credit fraud, and bribery were not isolated facts, but parts of a single pattern directed from above. The logic of that approach grew in the years after his death, and culminated in sweeping prosecutions that put multiple leaders in the same courtroom. He was gone, yet the structures he had managed, and the investigative tools honed while he lived, shaped what came next for everyone in his world. Outside that world, the League's footprint faded. Its newsletter appeared less often. Scholarship funds were spent down. Offices closed or shifted to more modest rooms. Other groups took up the work of representation with different methods and different voices. The memory of packed plazas did not disappear. It became an anecdote told at long tables during holiday dinners, a moment when pride felt like a parade. Parents would note that a man from their streets had won attention from national outlets by insisting on civility. Children who had once worn League buttons grew up and pursued different fights in different arenas. The city carried on, as cities do. People who study this history argue about whether his public campaign helped or hurt his private goals. Supporters say the movement opened space for respectful conversation, forced large institutions to treat a community as more than a stereotype, and gave ordinary families a reason to stand together in public without fear. Critics say the campaign invited scrutiny that no amount of discipline could handle, aggravated peers who valued silence, and brought a level of attention that turned private habits into public issues. Both sides find evidence in the record. The truth likely holds traces of both. He showed that a man from a closed world could, for a time, shape public talk. He also showed that a bright light draws glances from every direction. The catalog of wrongdoing tied to his circle stayed consistent across the years he rose and ruled. Illegal sports betting, numbers banking, card rooms operating behind legitimate fronts, loans at rates that punished the unwary and the unlucky, payments taken from shop owners in exchange for uninterrupted business, influence deployed across docks, warehouses, and job sites to slow or speed work, hijacked merchandise entering resale channels, stolen credit used to buy goods later fenced, kickbacks attached to contracts, bribes offered or solicited to smooth inspection schedules or union votes, and layers of fronts that turned raw cash into deposits that looked routine. Court papers often describe these actions as racketeering. He avoided explicit talk about them, in public and in private. The message to his people emphasized order, not swagger. What kept that machine from shaking itself apart was not force but predictability. The man at the center valued timetables. Collectors knew their routes and their hours. Meetings started on time and ended quickly. Decisions came down with a reason attached, even when the reason was a blunt. You knew the rule. He disliked big scenes. He taught lieutenants to sit far enough from the door to see who entered, and to leave before anyone noticed they had stayed long. That approach gave him a reputation among peers for steadiness. It also made him a target for those who believed that any public posture, however, careful violated the code that kept everyone safe. There were contradictions he never tried to hide. perhaps because he couldn't. He was a patriot who had worn a uniform and would point to his service when telling crowds about duty and fairness. He was also a man who moved money through channels that law and ethics condemned. He loved family dinners and sent money for school books. He sent men to collect fees that had no legal invoice and no receipt beyond the knowledge that next week would be calmer. He pressed a studio to avoid a slur while collecting from a business that paid because it feared a day without protection. The ledger of his life runs 2 columns that never meet. And that is the puzzle that keeps people talking. Even critics concede that he did not chase drama for its own sake. He rarely confused violence with strength. He disciplined men who mistook a loud gesture for leadership. That restraint did not make him soft. It made him focused on outcomes. Quieter routes to the same end appealed to him. A contract passed rather than a confrontation. A delivery on time rather than a day of shouting on a sidewalk. A debt paid after a measured talk rather than a busted window. In quiet, money arrives. In quiet, people breathe. That was his creed. As for the family name his world carried after him, it became a marker in headlines about internal wars, federal trials, and changing fortunes. Years later, a bitter struggle erupted over leadership, costing lives and stability. The violence of that period left scars on city streets and in old neighborhoods. Though he was not there to see it, some said the chaos proved his value as a calming presence, that his particular blend of discipline and negotiation had kept the temperature lower than anyone realized. Others argued that the seeds of later turmoil were planted by the very visibility he had embraced. He cannot answer either claim. The record merely shows that his tenure had fewer storms, and that the storms after him were harder to contain. There is a final picture people like to paint when their stories turn toward the quiet end of the night. It shows a man returning to a small table in a kitchen, removing his jacket, loosening his tie, and sitting with a cup of coffee gone cold. Papers are stacked neatly. A child's drawing is pinned to a corkboard. A phone rests face down. Outside, the city hums along. Inside, the same person who spent a day steering a blended world public charm on one side, private pressure on the other, sits completely still for a few minutes before sleep. That image may be imagined, assembled from bits of truth and the need for closure, but it matches what people who knew him say most often. He valued order, he kept his voice low, and he believed a steady hand could make even a rough life look almost normal from the sidewalk. By the time his story reached its last chapter, the outline was set. A boy from Brooklyn learned early that absence and danger cast long shadows. He left school, served his country, married young, and tried the straight path. A second path, built on old networks, drew him into a structure that combined crime, business, and community in ways that made sense to people on those blocks. He rose by calming tempers. He took over after stopping a reckless plot. He ran a family like a company and a movement like a campaign. He negotiated with a studio and argued with a nation's premier investigative agency from a podium on a city street. He was attacked while speaking, lived for years without his voice, and died with loved ones nearby. The crimes tied to his name are written in indictments and depositions. The civic gestures tied to his name are written in thank you notes and photographs. The arguments about what it all means continue. And still, in quiet rooms across the city, he once tried to organize and defend in his own way. People say his name and feel both pride and unease, which may be the most honest measure of a life lived at a difficult crossroads. Stories about him kept changing shape as years passed, yet they always returned to the same crossroads. People would sit at a kitchen table and trade memories like cards, each one offering a different angle. One remembered a quiet man who listened without interrupting. Another recalled a boss who never raised his voice but still made a room pay attention. A third brought up the rallies that looked like block parties more than protests. A fourth mentioned envelopes, union favors, and long shadows cast by soft words. The picture that formed was not neat. It was layered, full of sharp edges and careful routines, built by someone who believed he could hold two worlds together through discipline and timing. He had learned early to keep circles separate. The public saw a father, a neighbor, a small business figure, a veteran who said he loved his country and its promise. The private circle saw a director of revenue streams that fed a network sports wagers, numbers play, cards behind doors that said, members, loans that came fast and demanded punctual returns, payments from merchants who wanted calm nights and timely deliveries, and union influence that made schedules behave. Investigators and witnesses later tied his name to rings that handled stolen goods from hijacked trucks, schemes that used counterfeit or stolen credit to buy items later sold wholesale, and arrangements on construction sites where peace depended on regular transfers. The method was consistent across it all. He chose predictability over spectacle, rules over noise. His approach to law made sense if you stood in his shoes. He treated a subpoena like a business letter, a grand jury like a meeting where answers should be brief. He was charged more than once with lying under oath or hiding connections to companies that prosecutors viewed as fronts. He hired lawyers, posted bail, and avoided drama on courthouse steps. When a case fell apart, he did not crow. When it moved forward, he kept still. The strategy was simple: deny, delay, and divide attention so that no single proceeding defined him. It worked more often than it failed, not because he was untouchable, but because he seldom placed himself where a direct link could be proven beyond doubt. The sudden shift to public advocacy remains the turn that still surprises people who study his life. He founded a group with a name that sounded like a civic club and built it with the tools of a campaign. Volunteers ran phone lists, clergy said blessings, parents brought kids in strollers. The group asked agencies to change vocabulary, editors to think twice about headlines, studios to adjust scripts, and broadcasters to consider how portrayals shape a child's sense of self. It was not a loud movement. It was firm and organized. He did not rant. He used the cadence of a neighbor who had practiced his lines until they sounded like common sense. That approach brought results. A major production softened a script and filmed in the city without clashes. Newsrooms met with delegations. Officials took calls and answered letters. For a season, the image of a boss was replaced by the image of a spokesman. The irony is hard to miss. The film that agreed to avoid certain words became one of the most famous stories ever told about an Italian-American crime family. The city that watched a spokesman call for fairness also watched a wave of popular culture that cemented for many viewers the very images he had tried to soften. Even so, his negotiation mattered. It showed that influence could be traded for concessions without menace, that organized pressure could move a studio, and that community pride could, for a moment, shape how the country talked about a people. You can debate the long-term effect. You cannot deny the skill in the moment. After the attack, his life became a long quiet separated from public view. Days were measured by nurses' rounds, relatives' visits, and small signs that kept hope alive, even when doctors warned against it. He stayed at the center of a household that adapted to a new normal, where a chair by the window meant more than any stage. Outside that home, the machine he had overseen kept going, then adjusted as a strategist with deep roots gathered authority. The Gallo story reached its tragic point in a restaurant, setting off a round of analysis that still has not settled into one version. Old grudges rarely die cleanly. They fade and surge, shaped by new faces and old debts. The one constant is that when the person who balanced the weights is gone, the board tips faster. Cops and prosecutors updated their playbook during and after his time in charge. Instead of chasing one theft or one threat, they set out to map entire systems. Wiretaps captured names, nicknames, and habits. Ledgers matched phone calls to envelopes. Witnesses connected separate schemes into one pattern. A statute gave them a way to argue that bookmaking, loans, protection, union manipulation, credit fraud, fencing, and bribery were strands of a single web directed from above. Juries heard new kinds of cases. The city watched leaders who had dodged trouble for decades sit at long tables in federal courtrooms. He was gone by the time the biggest waves hit, but the tools sharpened in his era shaped the outcomes that followed. Back in the neighborhoods where he once walked without a bodyguard parade, memory did its own work. A baker kept a signed photo behind the counter. A barber hung a clipping about a scholarship fund in a simple frame. A parish elder recalled a visit from a man who spoke softly and left a check for a broken roof. Not everyone was nostalgic. Some store owners preferred the peace that came when envelopes were no longer expected. Younger families wanted a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes when jobs arrive without favors, when deliveries depend on contracts, not nods. The city grew and changed. Blocks that once felt like villages became crowded with new cuisines, new accents, new ambitions. His name stayed local, strong in certain corners, unknown in others. What he did can still be listed briskly without losing accuracy. He rose from an enforcer's son to a trusted ear, from a captain to a boss who avoided street theatrics. He managed illegal betting that treated wagers like a business with schedules and ledgers. He oversaw numbers play that turned pocket coins into steady profit. He took a cut from card rooms that ran on trust and routine. He approved loans that punished lateness and relied on pressure that rarely needed to become overt. He extracted payments from businesses in exchange for calm, packaging the deal as security or consulting. He influenced union processes so that contracts and deliveries behaved for friends and stalled for holdouts. He profited from schemes that handled credit fraud and stolen goods when those channels opened. He kept fronts in place to provide paper trails and meeting rooms. He faced perjury and conspiracy charges tied to these patterns, beat some, fought others, and kept walking. He built a movement that asked for respectful language and got it from some powerful desks. He paid for that visibility with an attack that took away his voice. He died years later with family close by. What he believed emerges from the way he acted. He trusted routine more than charisma. He used charm as a tool, not a mask. He viewed violence as costly, not glorious. He thought negotiations should leave the other side able to earn, because broken men create trouble. He built orders of the day that kept collectors punctual, captains focused, and rivals within known lines. He valued loyalty, but not blind loyalty. He moved out anyone whose ego endangered income. He separated spheres so that a donor to a scholarship fund might never know a man who sat at the back of a club to mind doors. He told himself the separation would hold. For a while it did. His story also sits inside a larger tale about the city. Old networks that once grew in immigrant quarters learned new habits as law enforcement modernized, and as the economy shifted from docks to data, unions changed. Shipping moved. Cash businesses gave way to credit machines, then to pixels. The rackets adapted, but not without strain. Crew structures that had felt unshakable proved fragile. The family that carried his name later endured a war over leadership that filled front pages and left scars. That turmoil convinced some that the man who kept schedules and softened tempers had been more important than the tabloids ever explained. Others said it was proof that no amount of discipline can hold a system together when it depends on leverage that the law and the market both push against over time. When friends speak about him at graveside on sunny days, they mix pride with caution. They say he gave ordinary people a place to be seen without having to shout. They say he kept arguments from breaking furniture. They also say he built his life out of acts that put him at odds with law and that hurt people who fell into debt or fear. They do not try to make him pure. They try to make him whole. It is a harder task and a more honest one. No single label fits. He was a father and a boss, a neighbor and a negotiator, a quiet speaker and a planner who knew how to pull strings without tangling them. He did what he thought would protect his circle, however he defined it. The results brought both comfort and harm. If there is a lesson in the way he lived, it may be this. Power that avoids noise lasts longer than power that seeks spotlights. Language matters, both in the law and in the home, because words teach children how to see themselves. Communities can ask to be treated fairly without pretending that crime never happens. Law can treat a network as a network, and not just as a series of isolated acts. People can hold two truths at once: that a movement made them feel proud, and that the man who led it built wealth from practices that the law must oppose. That combination is messy. It is also real. On certain afternoons, older men still sit on folding chairs outside storefronts and talk about the days when a small figure in a good suit could walk down the block and make everyone straighten up without a word. They argue, they laugh, they shake their heads. Their grandchildren pass by with headphones and a different soundtrack in their ears. The city they share holds both sets of stories. Somewhere between the chairs and the earbuds, the name still carries weight. Not because it is tidy, but because it refuses to be. He stepped from a private world into a very public one, and tried to hold them together as if they were two sides of a single coin. The metal got hot. The coin cracked. The mark it left on the table remains. He is gone, yet the track he laid is visible if you know where to look. It runs through union halls and along old piers, through courtrooms and newsrooms, through parish basements and film sets. It runs through the way people in the city speak about each other now, with sharper questions about labels and with memories that insist on nuance. It runs through casebooks and through family albums. It is not a straight line. It bends around hard corners and vanishes behind new buildings. That seems fitting. Straight lines belong to maps. He lived in a maze and learned how to move without scraping the walls, so people tell the story one more time. A boy loses his father and finds order in uniform. A young man returns to streets that value influence and restraint and learns to run an old machine with a modern hand. A leader avoids fireworks, favors steady income, and guides an outfit through feuds with careful steps. A spokesman builds a platform for pride, wins small changes that matter, stands in the sun, and refuses to look down. An attack ends his public life. Years of quiet follow. A death closes the book on the voice, not on the echoes. The crimes he benefited from fill indictments and depositions. The good deeds he funded fill bulletins and plaques. The choices he made carry consequences that ripple through the city long after the cars rolled away from the cemetery. If you walk by that old barber's framed clipping and pause, you might hear the murmur of a city that has learned to hold complicated stories without trying to flatten them. He would have liked that, the neatness of the frame and the calm of the room. He built a life on calm. He believed it could hold anything. It could not hold everything, but for a time, it held more than anyone thought possible. And that is why his name still rises like a quiet note at the end of a song, not to celebrate or to condemn, but to remind anyone who listens how much can happen when a person decides that control is the only way to survive, and how much can change when even the most controlled life meets a moment it cannot master.